This is the story of a shattered continent, a civilization brought to its knees under the shadow of fire and steel. The story of Europe, not the magnificent Europe of grand palaces or ancient universities, but the Europe that was ravaged, whose silence was broken only by screams and thunder. Between 1939 and 1945, this continent became the theater for the most destructive conflict in human history, a conflict that not only tore apart national borders, but also ripped at its collective soul. Imagine the moonless nights over London when sirens wailed, signaling the arrival of horror from the sky, or the freezing cold of the Russian winter, where millions of soldiers were buried not by the enemy, but by nature's deep freeze. This was not merely a war for territorial gain. It was a war of ideology, a moral war, and a war to define what it meant to be human. A massive storm that had long been brewing, finally erupting with devastating force, reshaping maps, replacing regimes, and most importantly, changing a generation's view of peace and brutality. The road to this destruction was not sudden. It was an accumulation of bitter resentment, vicious ambition, and the failure of diplomacy. We will trace the cracks that first appeared on the fragile foundation of peace. After the previous Great War, a foundation built upon sand. Mistrust and vengeance had taken root, growing into a slow-spreading poison, waiting for the moment to blossom into unbearable violence. The destruction of Europe is the story of unsung heroes, countless victims, and the monsters born of political desperation. It is a tale of cities reduced to ashes, of families separated forever, and of a light of civilization that nearly went out. 6 years of relentless suffering. A dark chapter that will forever haunt the world's collective memory. We will touch the core of this tragedy, understanding what was lost, and why that loss was so profound and irreparable. To understand the destruction, we must return to its seeds, sown in the fields of defeat and burdensome treaties. The turning point was the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, an agreement meant to end World War I, yet ironically, it sowed the very seeds for a far greater conflict. Germany, feeling humiliated and burdened with crippling reparations, became fertile ground for extremist nationalism and rage. It was amidst this economic chaos and national disgrace that ambitious figures rose. They offered simple solutions to complex problems: blame the other, resurrect past glories, and purge the nation of traitors. The ideologies of fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany were not sudden phenomena. They were pathological responses to the trauma of war, economic depression, and the failure of democracy. These totalitarian regimes promised order and strength, trading freedom for a false sense of security and racial supremacy. Meanwhile, the democratic powers, particularly Britain and France, were trapped in the despair known as the politics of appeasement. They chose to turn a blind eye to increasingly brazen aggression, the reoccupation of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, the dismantling of Czechoslovakia. The false hope that tyranny would be satisfied with small concessions was a tragic miscalculation that allowed the aggressor powers to build their war machines unopposed. Every small concession only reinforced the dictators' belief that the world lacked the will to resist. In the East, the Soviet Union under Stalin was also building its own tyranny, setting the stage for the most cynical political intrigue. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, an unlikely alliance between two ideological foes, opened the door for the invasion of Poland. This moment was not just a military invasion, it was a final rejection of the international order. By crossing the Polish border on September 3, 1939, Europe had stepped back into the abyss of darkness. The seeds of bitterness had matured, and the harvest was inevitable destruction. When the storm erupted, its speed was astonishing. Blitzkrieg, lightning. War was a cruel manifestation of new technology and tactics. The Netherlands, Belgium, France, great nations fell in a matter of weeks, not months. The fall of Paris in 1940 was not just a military loss, but a symbolic blow that shook Europe's entire belief in itself. The continent was divided, the majority dominated by Nazi power, the rest isolated and fighting alone. The peak of the conflict was the period from mid-1941 to 1943, when the war became total and merciless. The Eastern Front, Operation Barbarossa, was the most brutal ideological clash, where millions of lives were staked between Nazism and communism. Leningrad was besieged, Moscow nearly fell, and Stalingrad became hell on earth. It was here in the frozen steppes and wilderness of Russia that Hitler's limitless ambitions began to crack. Germany's defeat at Stalingrad was not the end, but a monumental psychological turning point. It signaled that the Reich's war machine was not invincible. Along the sprawling battle lines, there was also horror behind the front, the Holocaust. The systematic slaughter of 6 million Jews and millions of other minorities was not a side effect of the war, but a central part of Nazi ideology. From the ghettos to the extermination camps, this industry of death was the most terrifying manifestation of Europe's moral collapse. It showed how thin the veneer of civilization is when hatred and dehumanization are organized by the state. Meanwhile, the European skies became a relentless battleground. Strategic bombing by the Allies devastated German industrial and cultural cities. The destruction of Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin from the air was a deadly mix of vengeance and strategy, showing that no place was safe, no civilian immune. Every victory, every advance had to be paid for with the price of blood, infrastructure devastation, and a gradual loss of humanity. The storm had struck, and Europe was barely recognizable beneath its own ruins. The destruction of Europe could not be isolated. The fire that ignited on this continent quickly spread across oceans, turning a regional conflict into a true world war. The involvement of the United States, triggered by the attack in the Pacific, and the entry of conflict into North Africa, the Mediterranean and Southeast Asia, were all interconnected with Europe's fate. Decisions and actions in Paris or Berlin had direct echoes in Tokyo, Cairo, and Washington. This war, initially driven by European ambition, became a planetary-scale clash. Resources from around the world were drawn into the vortex of conflict. Soldiers from Canada, Australia, India, and other colonial nations fought and died on European, African, and Asian soil. It was a globalization of suffering, demonstrating how interconnected the world was, even in the most destructive of ways. Politically, the war permanently altered the global balance of power. The once dominant European powers, Britain and France, were left exhausted and bankrupt, effectively marking the end of the era of European colonialism. In their place, two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, emerged from the wreckage, each carrying conflicting visions for the world. The victory over Nazism was quickly replaced by a new ideological tension, the Cold War. Even after the final battles subsided in May 1945, the impact continued to resonate. Millions were displaced, borders were redrawn, and entire cities had to be rebuilt from the rubble. The material loss in Europe was immense, but the human loss, estimated at 50 to 70 million lives worldwide, was a wound that will never heal. Europe's destruction taught a costly lesson. That brutality on one continent can easily engulf the entire globe, and that peace is not a natural state, but a fragile construction that must be fiercely defended. As the final smoke cleared and the dust of war began to settle, Europe was confronted with a shattered mirror. What remained was a monumental devastation, not just the ruin of buildings, but the destruction of ideas and beliefs. The continent had to ask, how could the civilization that created Beethoven, Shakespeare, and great cathedrals give birth to Auschwitz? The answer to that question is the core of the post-war reflection. The post-war era was not instant relief. The psychological and moral trauma was profound. Europe was split into East and West by the Iron Curtain, an ideological fault line that froze the continent, in tension for decades. Yet, from these ashes was born a powerful desire for reconciliation and rebuilding. The project of European integration, starting with coal and steel partnerships, was a recognition that the only way to prevent future wars was to permanently bind their economic and political destinies. Memory is the most important weapon in this destructive legacy. Monuments, museums, and the testimonies of victims stand as eternal, reminders of the unimaginable cost of hatred and tyranny. The individual stories of those who survived the camps, who fought underground and who rebuilt their cities, are the narratives that form the foundation of modern European identity. It is a story of human resilience, but also a constant warning about moral vulnerability, the destruction of Europe in world. War II is an epic of suffering that transformed the world. It is a story that underscores the failure of institutions, the danger of fanaticism, and humanity's willingness to commit unimaginable horrors. Today, as Europe stands as a symbol of peace and unity, we must never forget that the foundation of that unity was built upon rubble. The script of its history is written in blood and fire, a lesson that will forever resonate. The price of peace is eternal vigilance, and the cost of war is the loss of everything. And that tragedy, though over, will never be forgotten.